My name is Vivekanand Sondhi, and on behalf of the ML Sondhi Trust and ML Sondhi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs, I welcome you to today's webinar. Though we've all returned to the post-COVID real world, the legacy with regards to virtual webinars will perhaps be permanent. Only in such a setting can we have such a brilliant panel. My welcome to General Jung and Dr. Lakhvinder Singh from South Korea. Welcome to Dr. Pramesha Saha, General Lamba, and Ambassador Vishnu Prakash from India, Dr. Swaran Singh from Vancouver in Canada. I myself am in the United Arab Emirates, and Dr. Shivaji Sondhi, who hopefully will join us soon, is at Oxford in the United Kingdom. My welcome to all participants. Late Professor Sondhi was an academic, diplomat, parliamentarian, but above all a charismatic intellectual and public figure in the broadest sense of the term. Professor Sondhi passed away in 2003, and for most of his active life, he had advocated recommendations, foreign policy recommendations that were at times seen as contrarian and controversial, but were accepted later, and by now, many of his recommendations have become conventional wisdom. For example, amongst the Indian foreign policy intelligentsia, Professor Sondhi was one of the first to look at the larger Asia Pacific and India's place in it. For example, long before the term Indo-Pacific came in vogue, Professor Sondhi foresaw the emergence of Indian Ocean at the center of global politics with his assertion that, and here I'm quoting from an article he wrote with Professor Ashok Kapoor in 2002, and I quote, "The new frontier and center of gravity is the Indian Ocean, which is the junction where Chinese, American, Russian, and Japanese interests converge, and they collide potentially between China and the rest in the military sphere in the coming decade," end quote. He also underscored the emergence of a democratic quad in Asia in the same article by suggesting that, in quotes, Japan, India, USA, and Australia have a convergent interest to keep the lines of military and commercial communications clear in the strategic sea lanes which extend from the Sea of Japan to the Gulf and Israel, end quote. In this 50th year of India-South Korea diplomatic relations, the theme of today's webinar would have had a special resonance for Professor Sondhi. In an era where Indian elite opinion was still in thrall of state planning, Soviet model of development and non-alignment, the unfolding economic miracles and democratic changes in South Korea and other Pacific Rim economies were given a pass in New Delhi. Professor Sondhi wrote extensively on South Korea, India-South Korea relations, India's role in the Korean Peninsula, himself organized and took part in many seminars on Korea, and visited Seoul several times. He had a close friendship with Ambassador and later Foreign Minister Lee Bum-suk, and had excellent relationships with various South Korean diplomats and academicians. With the end of the Cold War, India could abandon many constraining shibboleths in foreign and economic policy, and its engagement with South Korea expanded and deepened. However, Professor Sondhi had high expectations. I quote from an article he wrote in 1998. India's stake in Korea is enormous. Although our foreign policy elite spends little time or energy in articulating policies for adjusting to East Asia, elements which stabilize or destabilize the East Asian regional system directly affect the United States, Russia, China, and Japan, and should receive high level of attention from New Delhi, end quote. I await to hear from the experts regarding their assessment and expectations for the India-South Korean engagement. One housekeeping. Can I request all participants to avail of the Zoom chat box to send in their questions so that the chair and the panelists can respond to them in the Q&A session. I would now like to request Ambassador Vishnu Prakash to share his opening remarks and chair the proceedings henceforth. Thank you.
Good evening. Namaste, Anyang Hashimnika, Thank you, Dr. Vivekananda Lal Sondhi. Major General Jung Hae Il, nice to see you. I know it is quite late in South Korea now. Dr. Premesha Saha, Lieutenant General Arvind Singh Lamba, Dr. Swaran Singh, good morning. You were up early at the crack of dawn. Dr. Lakhvinder Singh, my old friend from Seoul. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the special symposium on challenges and opportunities for India-South Korea defense and strategic cooperation. And I would sincerely like to thank the M.L. Sondhi Institute for Asia-Pacific Affairs for conceptualizing and hosting the event. What could have been a better time than the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between India and Republic of Korea, also known as the miracle on the River Han. Over the years, our ties between the two vibrant economies have blossomed and expanded rapidly, given mutual goodwill, convergence of interests, cultural linkages, the bonds of Buddhism, and economic complementarities. We elevated bilateral relations to the level of special strategic partnership in 2015. And I'm happy to say that highest level exchanges and attention have provided momentum to the ties. We in India regard South Korea as an indispensable partner in our Act East strategy. It is the 10th largest economy in the world, a technological powerhouse with growing military capabilities. I have had the good fortune of flying the Indian flag in Seoul between 2012 and 2015. I firmly believe that Korea's rag to riches journey in a matter of 4 decades is the greatest success story of the 20th century and an inspiration to everyone, all nations, small or big. Speaking at an investment conference in October 2018 in Uttarakhand, Prime Minister Modi spoke from his heart. I quote him, he said, "I was asked what I consider an ideal model for Gujarat. Generally, one would expect replies such as, oh, it should be America or England. But I said I wanted to make Gujarat like South Korea. I said population of Gujarat and South Korea was similar. So is the length of the coast. I have studied South Korea's development journey in detail and decided that Gujarat should go in the same direction." This is the Prime Minister of the country, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is the most popular leader in the world for the 8th year running, according to all opinion polls. Economic engagement has been and remains the mainstay of India-Korea relations. Bilateral trade touched an all-time high of $28 billion approximately in 2022, making the US $50 billion target by 2030 feasible. Even so, it is far below the actual potential. Efforts are underway to upgrade SEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and now 9 rounds of negotiations have been held. A major challenge is India's serious concerns on the growing trade deficit between the two countries, which is politically and economically unsustainable, as well as India's concerns on market access issues, including tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Korean investments in India were US $7.27 billion, about 7.3 billion in 2021. Certainly not enough, but I'm sure South Korean friends, South Korean corporations will know the tremendous opportunities available in India. Indian investments are in the region of $5 billion. It is encouraging that India and Korea, when I say Korea, I mean South Korea, along with Australia, Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, United States, and a few other Indo-Pacific nations, recognizing that their economic and security interests were intertwined, launched the process to establish the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. Discussions would be held on several pillars, including trade, resilient and well-integrated supply chains, clean energy, and effective and robust tax and anti-corruption regimen to strengthen and deepen cooperation. It's also encouraging that our multidimensional ties are expanding in newer areas, comparatively newer areas like defense, security, cyberspace, renewable energy, communication and information technology, climate action, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, startups, and other areas. Deputy Trade Minister of Korea, Jung Hae Il, highlighted potential for cooperation in future industries like electronic vehicles and batteries, clean and renewable energy, hydrogen economy, and so on and so forth. I personally feel that establishment of a semiconductor chips plant in India by South Korea could be a game changer for the South Korean companies and their image in India, which already is very high. We welcome South Korea's recently announced Indo-Pacific strategy. It should open up more opportunities for developing synergies. The strategy envisions South Korea as a global pivotal state and is anchored on three principles of cooperation, namely inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. However, I must be candid, translating the policy on ground would entail considerable tightrope walking for Seoul, given its defense and strategic partnership with the US, its critical economic, tourism, and cultural engagement with China, South Korea's security and threat perception from North Korea, China, and Russia, as also uncertain ties with Japan. We watched with horror as last year, North Korea conducted the largest number of missile tests ever. Experts believe that the next nuclear test is imminent. It is therefore a matter of grave concern that Pyongyang's weapons of mass destruction capabilities and ability to threaten the peace and stability in Northeast Asia and beyond is increasing regularly. India joined the US and other nations to strongly condemn North Korea's ICBM test in November 2022. We support denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. In fact, we have a vested interest in that happening, unlike many other players who pay lip service, if I were to say that. Prime Minister Modi told or shared his opinion with President Moon in July 2018 by saying that proliferation linkages between Northeast Asia, read North Korea, and South Asia is a matter of grave concern for India. We are also a stakeholder in the peace process. Prime Minister Modi was referring to essentially to the unholy alliance between North Korea, Pakistan on the one hand, and North Korea, China on the other. There is ample evidence of two-way proliferation between Pakistan and North Korea. Having said that, noted that there is need to further enhance the strategic content in India-South Korea relationship. Here it is noteworthy that our defense relations are steadily expanding. Our defense ministers have been interacting annually since 2015. Several forums have been instituted for regular interaction between the sides, including the foreign policy and the security dialogue, the 2+2 dialogue at the level of secretaries and vice ministers, which is a very important dialogue, annual joint committee meeting for cooperation in defense industries and logistics between the Minister DAPA and Secretary of India every year. Defense industries cooperation is the mainstay of strategic cooperation between our countries. A roadmap for defense industries cooperation was signed between the two countries in September 2019. Korea, we know, has the requisite technology, is cost competitive, and is showing more inclination to share technology, as also consider possibilities of co-development and joint production of defense platforms. We have signed multiple agreements extending from logistic support to information exchanges pertaining to operational matters. Maritime cooperation has shown a lot of promise. Army, Navy, and Coast Guard, Army to Army relations, Navy and Coast Guard ships have been visiting each other's ports regularly and also holding joint exercises. Maritime cooperation can be advanced in areas like shipbuilding, and a bilateral MOU already exists. Also in areas like maritime realm awareness, humanitarian aid, and disaster relief, search and rescue, marine cooperation, anti-terror, prevention of marine pollution, to just name a few. In close, ladies and gentlemen, I would say that I'm very bullish on India-Korea relationship. I'm convinced that we are destined to be the closest friends and partners. Both sides need to further step up on the gas to make it happen sooner than later. I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I come to the second part of the main part of the interaction. We have 5 distinguished speakers. Their bio profiles have already been outlined. I will not repeat that, so you'll bear with me. I would go in the order in which the names have been reflected in the flyer, and would request each panelist to take 10 to 12 minutes so that we have about 30 minutes thereafter for questions and answers or interaction amongst us. With this, I have great pleasure in inviting Major General Jung to share his thoughts. The floor is yours, Major General.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm very nice to meet you. And thank you for inviting me to the strategic cooperation dialogue between Korea and India. And I personally feel very honored. I have been working in the Korean military for 33 years and have mainly been in charge of strengthening the Korea and US alliance. While serving as the chief of the policy at the ROK US Combined Forces Command, I served as the position to ensure that the US extended deterrence capabilities can be deployed in a timely manner at the height of North Korea's nuclear threat. And also I have experience in negotiating with India on the export of air defense weapons, so-called Flying Tiger, Korean name is Biho, while serving as military assistant to the Minister of Defense in 2018. In addition, based on my experience working in various fields, such as military diplomacy and defense industry cooperation at the Ministry of National Defense and Presidential House, I would like to present areas where Korea and India should cooperate in the future. When I attended the 7th Regional Conference in India in May last year and explained the Yoon Suk-yeol government's strategy for the Indo-Pacific, many participants at the regional conference were very interested. The reason is that Korea has been perceived in its Indo-Pacific strategy because it has valued economic cooperation with China. However, as the strategic conflict between the US and China intensifies, Korea is no longer able to maintain its traditional strategy of expanding its economy with China while cooperating its security with the US. In particular, through the war between Ukraine and Russia, the world is moving toward a situation where the separation of global supply chains intensifies and free trade can no longer be maintained. In East Asia, military tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan are escalating, and the crisis on the Korean Peninsula is also escalating due to North Korea's nuclear armament. Korea and Japan are still developing toward strengthening the Korea-US-Japan alliance while maintaining an uncomfortable feeling about the past, but they seem to have a time bomb that can reproduce the conflict between Korea and Japan at any time. In the international, very conflictive order of East Asia, which has these complex and structural problems, India can be regarded as a strategic partner for new opportunities for Korea's future survival strategy, I think. India, the world's second largest population, is the world's most competitive country in IT technology and respects democratic values. Korea is a special country that historically has a very deep-rooted bond feeling that descends from Princess Ayutthaya. The security situation India has experienced so far is very similar to that of Korea. The security crisis management system, which has maintained deterrence amid the escalation of the nuclear crisis with Pakistan, is a very valuable experience for Korea to learn. The security situation, which has to manage various disputes at the border, is similar to that of Korea. India's efforts to strengthen its defense capabilities by improving its own defense capabilities, which it has relied on Russia, can draw many lessons from the experience of self-defense and defense reform that Korea has been striving since the 1970s. India's security situation is not only optimistic. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, exchanges with Russia have not been free due to international sanctions, and relations with China are also very unstable. India must have the most reliable partner to achieve the modernization of its national defense capabilities. Korea has the experience of modernizing its defense capabilities by growing into the world's 10th largest economy since the Korean War in the 1950s. Currently, Korea has the technology and production capability to produce various high technology weapons, including, for example, K9 self-propelled guns, tanks, armored vehicles, Aegis destroyers, air defense weapon systems, and T-50 fighter jets. However, defense cooperation with India is now beginning at a very early stage. If the defense cooperation market between Korea and India is pioneered and mutual trust is established, I believe it will be a very developing opportunity for the national interests of both countries. As such, Korea and India have many areas to cooperate in, such as defense cooperation, IT technology, aerospace technology, and nuclear deterrence. It will give each other an opportunity to create many benefits in the field of cultural exchange where India and Korea interact. The younger generation of BTS loving India and the younger generation, including me, of India loving Bollywood have already formed a great cultural and spiritual bond. I watched every single of Indian Bollywood movies. For example, Three Idiots. This strong bond will be a great help for the two countries to work together. In the future, we hope that this strategic dialogue will continue to expand and develop, contributing greatly to creating opportunities for exchange and cooperation between Korea and India. But before preparing for this seminar, I have many meetings with Korean businessmen who have many deal with India. They are very confessed to me. There are so many obstacles, especially the cultural misunderstanding between Korea and India. So I think such a dialogue forum will very good ways to solve the misunderstanding between the Korean and India's business culture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Major General Jung, compliments for a wonderful address. You have made some very, very pertinent points. But on a lighter note, I'm very happy to hear about your definition of youth. And I've suddenly started feeling younger also. So thank you very much. That is very, very good. But yes, you're right. I have also always wondered whose security environment is more complicated, South Korea's or India's. Both our security environments are very complicated, and we need to be vigilant constantly. And your experience in developing indigenous defense capabilities is an experience that is we can gain from. Thank you very much, sir, for your address. And now I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Premasha Saha for her address. Premasha.
Yes, thank you so much. Firstly, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this timely webinar. I have been asked to speak about the evolving strategic realities in the Indo-Pacific, but I would also like to touch on a little bit on Korea's recently released Indo-Pacific strategy, because I feel it has a lot in common with India's own Indo-Pacific vision and ambitions as well. To begin with, when we talk of the Indo-Pacific is essentially a maritime geography. It's essentially a geography. But most countries depict its geographical contours according to its own interests. But if we see the recently released Korea strategy on Indo-Pacific, the geography defined by Korea's Indo-Pacific is very similar to the way India defines its own Indo-Pacific geography. So along those lines also, where India faces that when we come to US's definition of Indo-Pacific or Australia's definition of Indo-Pacific, it differs from India's own. But a country like Korea, the geographical definition of Indo-Pacific is very similar. The reason I'm saying this is when that becomes similar, in many ways, the visions and ambitions also align. Secondly, when we talk about India's Indo-Pacific, obviously India, unlike the US or even Australia, we do not have a foreign policy white paper or a defense white paper. So we essentially have an Indo-Pacific vision, which was laid out by Prime Minister Modi at the 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue during his keynote speech and several other high-level visits when we analyze those statements. If we look at how India's Indo-Pacific vision or policy has evolved, obviously Act East forms a very important pillar of that policy. And when we talk of the Act East, initially it was referred to as the Look East. And when this renaming happened, many questioned what is the difference between the Look East and Act East. And I think one of the major differences was the broadening of the focus when it came to Act East. Look East primarily focused on Southeast Asia, but Act East also took into consideration East Asia, Oceania, the entire eastern region of the Far East, basically. So in those ways also, South Korea featured in a big way in India's Act East policy. And as Ambassador Prakash has already mentioned in his opening remarks, he has laid the backdrop to the India-Korea relations very well, so I will not go into that. But if we look at how India has been championing its Indo-Pacific, how India has been going about with its own Indo-Pacific ambitions, think the fact that India is a part of so many unilateral and plurilateral partnerships goes on to say that India's main approach to the Indo-Pacific is to work with like-minded countries. And I think that is the same approach that even the Republic of Korea is trying to adopt in its own Indo-Pacific strategy, where it has been clearly mentioned that besides bilateral partnerships, also it is looking to involve in these unilateral alliances, especially the Quad. It has highlighted, they have appreciated the Quad in a big way. And even if it might be difficult, obviously, to bring in a Quad country at the moment, to bring in a country like Korea as a part of the Quad at the moment, and make it a Quad Plus. But what Quad has done over the years has coming up with various working groups. And I think it is time to involve countries like Korea and even Taiwan to some of these working groups, especially one on critical and emerging technology, climate change, health, and the very recently formed one on maritime security. Because these are the primary areas which have also been outlined in Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy as the areas they look forward to, strengthening cooperation when it comes to countries in the Indo-Pacific. India has obviously found a mention, and as the previous speaker has very rightly mentioned, has been recognized as a country with a growing population and having a lot of talent and skill when it comes to IT and space technology. So obviously, those are the areas where also a lot of cooperation can happen. Another thing with regard to the Indo-Pacific is also that obviously India is also looking to diversify its economic partnerships, its supply chain networks, especially after COVID and especially after the Galwan Valley clash. That has been one of the main approaches, and we have seen such supply chain networks coming up, for example, between India, Japan, Australia. And I think there is a prospect for those kind of initiatives broadening and also bringing in countries like Korea, which are already a part of, say, the Indo-Pacific economic framework and are keen to work with countries like India on such new initiatives as well. Besides that, I think when we look at the Indo-Pacific and India's own vision also, as Korea has mentioned in the strategy, that it is trying to evolve as a global pivotal state. And though India's Indo-Pacific strategy, I will not disagree. Obviously, when we talk of Indo-Pacific strategies, and it has a lot to do with the developing or with the underlying China threat, which is making countries come up more vociferously voice their Indo-Pacific policies and stuff. But at the same time, India has its own vision of emerging as a global player to maintain its own strategic autonomy. And I think the statements of our External Affairs Minister on many platforms, where it says that India has to choose its own side, why can't India have its own side, goes on to show that India is also aiming to emerge as a potent global player when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And that is a similar aim and ambition even Republic of Korea has, basically to have an influence in the affairs of the Indo-Pacific, because Indo-Pacific is a region right now where most of what the dynamic or the evolution of global politics is happening. So I think both these countries want to have a voice when it comes to these global happenings in the Indo-Pacific as well. And besides that, obviously, when it comes to defense and security, things are happening. Maritime security is a very potent area of cooperation. And I think Korea can also become a part of our Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. I think there is a lot of prospect there, especially when it comes to science and technology pillar as well. Blue economy is also one more. But in the Korean strategy, it has also been mentioned that there has to be cooperation on hard security issues like for example, the South China Sea challenge has also been brought out. Another thing I think which needs to be looked into is both these countries are looking very much to engage with Southeast Asia. Even when it comes to India's Act East policy, obviously ASEAN has been said to, ASEAN is a fulcrum of that policy. Even in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN centrality has been stressed on repeatedly. And even, even with the previous Moon administration, the New South policy, the New Southern policy, the main focus was obviously India and Southeast Asia. To look beyond Northeast Asia, that was the aim. And I think so India and Korea can also do a lot together with countries in Southeast Asia, who, especially in the economic domain, because for Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific is mostly looked at as an economic theater rather than a strategic one. And that is very clearly seen from the way these countries are maintaining a balance, a strategic balance when it comes to US-China Great Power competition. So that leaves an open space for countries like India, Korea, who are also really with the US-China Great Power competition to work with countries like in Southeast Asia, who are said to be caught in the middle of this Great Power competition. So a lot can be done in ASEAN as well. So there is a possibility for cooperating and working in third regions, in other regions as well. Another thing where a lot of cooperation can happen is connectivity. And that can be maritime connectivity as well, because when I'm talking about Southeast Asia, for example, the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity 2025 is a very important pillar when we talk of ASEAN. And even in all foreign ministers meeting, the recent one which just happened with Indonesia taking over the chair, the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity always finds a mention, and that is an area of cooperation where not only Korea, but also India, Japan, Korea, and other Quad countries can work together. I think there can be a lot of cooperation happening in that genre as well. So with this, I will stop here, and I look forward to questions and comments at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saha, for outlining key areas of cooperation, which you have put your finger right on the pulse. And these are, I agree with you that these are areas, and you also highlighted connectivity, which is very, very important. I agree with you that Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy holds a lot of promise. Later on, when it is possible, I would invite you to share your thoughts on how Korea can balance its ties between Japan and the US. If possible, if you or other panelists can reflect on that, that will be useful, because there is a counter pull, counter pressures, and it's not going to be easy. With that, it's my great pleasure to invite my good friend, Lieutenant General Lamba, to share his thoughts. General Lamba, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I'm grateful to my thanks to Professor Sondhi, Institute of Asia Pacific Affairs. Back again with them here. And I think we've had a series of discussions on South Korea as well. I will share my thoughts, sir, as listed out to me, that what are the threats from North Korea, threats from China in South China Seas, and therefore where do we merge? That's the three derivatives I've made for myself. And Dr. Premasa about the Indo-Pacific strategy. I will draw a few aspects that really make the two countries look in the same direction, not only because there are not common threats really today, but the threats are quite similar. And that is where the convergence between India and South Korea, looking towards China or North Korea, could be. We know that the Korean Peninsula is now 75 years. They've celebrated their 75th anniversary yesterday, and we saw the display of weaponry in a parade that was in Pyongyang yesterday. It showed the biggest missile, Hwasong 17, being displayed and watched by the leader Kim and his younger sister, 19-year-old or daughter, or whatever they say. So this is a peninsula, strangely, for 7 decades, has been on the edge of war always. Nothing has changed, and things have only hardened. And I think this is what makes geopolitics of this region so important and also so crisis-prone. Today, the crisis can actually lead to a nuclear war. We have a scenario already in Ukraine that's unfolding. We have something else in South China Seas, but to come to in the Korean Peninsula, it is probably at a real crisis, and because this kind of escalation has not been seen in the past. I will touch upon North Korea. Its traditional and conventional threat. I mean, I'm told to cover threats. I just covered briefly the traditional and the conventional threat. The numbers are huge compared to South Korea, but I think it's an army that's old, that's got obsolete equipment, it's got obsolescent equipment, but it got numbers in every way, from soldiers to tanks, double in every way than South Korea. Of course, South Korea is hugely high-tech in its weaponry. It doesn't need that kind of manpower, and it's doing a great job in its self-reliant, self-defense and modern technologies. So I think the traditional threat, in my view as an army man, it's almost mixed. He's got long-range artilleries where he can hit Seoul. That's the biggest warning he keeps giving. That could kill a huge amount of people, not by conventional artillery. But I think when it gets down to the CBRN effect and weapons of mass destruction, whenever we think about millions of casualties in Seoul alone, it's all to do with weapons of mass destruction. No artillery can cause that much. So we see so we move to the new threat, and I would call it, it's not a new threat, but it has become a different level of threat today. We have more than 100 missile tests done in 2022. The figures may vary a bit, and the ranges just simply go on increasing. We had the Hwasong 4, we had the Hwasong 7, 8, we had 14, and today we have 17. And I think the ranges have gone up from nearly 400 kilometers to over 7,000 kilometers. In other words, it covers Hwasong 17, covers New York, covers US mainland, maybe California, maybe Seattle, and maybe anywhere else on the western coast. The display of their power yesterday on the parade really reflects not the capability, but the mental mindset of North Korea, which is really the cause of crisis in the international domain. It doesn't have much to do with capability, because that way Russia has the largest number of weapon systems, of strategic nuclear weapon systems, but it may never be able to, it has, its deterrence already seems to have failed. So I think I'll cover that as we go along. And I think today we need to guard against the North Korea's nuclear threat, and that is its escalation and its irrationality. So when we put together its irrational escalation, there are two things that strike us more. First is the range of the Hwasong 17, which now today threatens the United States. The induction of the TNWs, the tactical nuclear weapons, which are solid fuel, and which it is supposed that last month when the leader himself, Kim himself, attended, some of these short-range solid fuel missiles were also fired. And that brings in the element of tactical nuclear weapons, which means it has already identified not just targets in the long range or depth, but it is in the immediate battlefield of a tactical nature, which means it is actually threatening, is my reading, it's like threatening South Korea of destroying its major facilities on the DMZ, or astride the DMZ on its own side. Third and most important is what really makes this a crisis, like I said earlier. And I think the turn of its doctrine, and its doctrine has a few serious components. Sorry, before that, the CBRN threat is very live today, because any leader who has prompted the country to move forward on the nuclear direction, he has carried with it the CBRN, that's the chemical, biological, radiological weapons as well. And by any guess, the number of bombs of chemical and other weapons that it has could be anything from 2 to 20,000, which means it can randomly fire and create havoc in any new conflict. And coming back and to address the how do we see the North Korean new threat is the nuclear threat, and that is the doctrinal shift is something that's stark. It's the doctrinal push that he's trying to give to show to the world that this will work. And in that doctrine, the most significant perception that Kim is trying to show across is firstly that it is weapons that can not only do a war but can win limited wars. So he really thinks that such a war can actually win him subjugation of South Korea. And second is he would also target simultaneously America, because that would beat the essence of the alliance, that will undermine the essence of the alliance and make it that much more difficult for United States to respond instantly. And I think these are the two elements of doctrinal shift that have made it. We all know that it left the NPT way back in 1991 or 92, if I recall. But that is the serious threat. A word about China, though I'm supposed to cover China as it relates to its threats in South China Sea. I thought very important to touch upon the threats from North Korea and how China is really associated with it. North Korea is a real asset to China, a real asset in its conflict situations with United States. The Korean missile tests have brought United States in range, and that makes so much easier for the North Koreans to disturb the alliance with the United States, who may not respond then. It also brings, in a way, Japan into range and threatens the entire alliance, that is the US, South Korea, and Japan. And finally, I also think that the recent firings could have tested the efficiency of the THAAD system, that's deployed in South Korea. And for China, these are 4 domains that really give the substance to North Korea. In my view, China is the sole ally, and any opportunity that North Korea presents to United States is golden in perceptions of China. And rest I'll leave to that, because China has tried to always step back when it comes to hyphenating the two. But I have these military reasons and security perspectives to say that China is a standby, a close player with North Korea. Coming to China, the next part I have to cover in the South China Seas, the assertiveness is really phenomenal. The problem with the world has been hard bases when they were coming up in the Indian Ocean. They were called the string of pearls. We all knew what the string of pearls would be. They would be just a string of mines to be activated when by personal domination, intervention, and outreach when the time comes. And I think that's happened. I remember having heard a commentary of one of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, one of the generals who was flying over these 3 reefs, and don't have to name them. These 3 reefs have today been fully militarized. They can take on fighter jets. They can actually station 30 to 40 submarines, and they can take on n number of fighter aircraft wherever they are required. And I'm talking of the regions south, Incal, Hainan, the entire area south into the South China Seas. The three areas you're well aware of is the Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross, and there is one more, I think. So these are the 3 which today, despite the world talking about them for 20 years, the world couldn't stop them. So the threat of China in the South China Seas is not live. It's taken to a point of crisis. And we need to look at it that way, so that what we see, we actually do something about it today. So if these be the threats, what are the opportunities for India and Korea in special strategic partnerships? That's the substance of highlighting these. First is we know that South Korea, the change of leadership has at least started looking from away north, a policy of unification that has failed. And North Korea and China were both very excited about that policy because it gave them the ability to threaten, pressurize, and compel South Korea to actually seek unification. And the underline was it would all be united under the rule of North Korea, and there would be no balance as I ever saw it. And South Korea also hopes to be a global pivotal state, and therefore it has to reach out to big powers. And to me, India is no longer an emerging power. India is a beyond the middle power status, and it is the right power for Korea to align with. Third, the strategy that while both countries look for growth, it's time that in the domains of Indo-Pacific, a region that, as Dr. Vivekanand highlighted, was thought about Professor Sondhi long back, well before it ever came. I think this is the real opportunity for India and Korea to make Indo-Pacific impacted by an alignment that could actually stand a good bulwark against the rise of China. Some of these things I mentioned, bulwark would mean an endeavor to stop them from moving further south or threatening or by a situation that nobody else can respond to. So I think these are the two major things in security perspectives. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash had rightly mentioned that the defense minister has virtually been visiting South Korea every year. A lot has happened. I'm aware of all that has gone through, but I do see in security two elements happening. The high technology of South Korea is phenomenal. One can count from aircraft to submarines, guns, tanks. A little flavor of which we have with us is K9. And K9, and if you go ahead to read about the K9 advanced weapon systems, I think they are a next level completely. We also see in the Indo-Pacific is highlighted the contextualized by Premasa. I think in the Indo-Pacific, it's as much got to be a military cooperation as well. South Korea till recently did have that inhibition, and it was shy of looking at India, but away from China. And these two cannot happen any longer. Whether it's economic or military, I think both have to look at each other towards the same direction, towards the same inspiration if they have to address the Chinese threat. Finally, we are aware of advanced weapon systems, more of them I don't need to mention. Technology transfers is going to be something that will put both the countries. We have Atmanirbharta now, self-reliance, where the new policy is one of excluding technologies and equipment that will not be imported from abroad. So I think that policy has been a big change with this government. It's one of exclusion to say, barring n number of systems every year as the development takes place. And finally, on the maritime cooperation, I briefly mentioned, but I leave it here to say that the India and South Korea can truly cooperate and enhance the maritime partnership. A bit has already been said by earlier speakers. As a strategic partnership, my second last point is no defense cooperation, no strategic partnership can be a full perspective without talking of economic cooperation. And Ambassador Vishnu Prakash had rightly highlighted that we intend to go to 50 billion trade in 2030. And if that be the target, we need a very strong economic component, a passage, bodies that must facilitate it. I've seen that sometimes when defense cooperation takes place, there are the lack of suitable platforms of either side necessitate G2G purchases, like it happens with Americans all the time. You go to government, there should be a free passage where this can take place. So the economic cooperation will be very important. And finally, what therefore has South Korea and India to see and look together in the same direction? We can elevate this strategic partnership because the threats are quite same. And one similarity I'll draw, since I've lived through that, is the Pakistan nuclear rise and where it led us. And in just 2 points, we saw when Pakistan turned nuclear. Second, Pakistan brought in the TNF. And why did they bring the TNF? Was because India went, and I was a part of it, and this is now an open domain, that India went in for a proactive strategy, a strategy that actually threatened Pakistan, and Pakistan justified the entry of its TNWs. I think North Korea too has not used the same analogy, but bringing in TNWs is actually like threatening territorial targets, military targets in the tactical or operational battlefield. Second, that the
General Lampa, 1 minute, please.
30 seconds more, sir. Last sentence. Thank you, sir. Is that the three alliances, that's South Korea, US, South Korea, Japan, India, US strategic partnership. It's not an alliance. So I think all of that gets affected by the threats from North Korea and indirectly by China. So I think this whole region, South China Seas and North Korea put together, have to be seen in a larger perspective, and India, Korea can surely take steps forward to make a significant difference. Thank you, sir. I've exceeded my time by 2 minutes. Apologize for that.
Not at all. Your presentation has been very comprehensive and substantive. You have touched upon critical issues, which add a lot of value to the deliberations that we have at hand. You're right, sir, that the growing military capabilities of North Korea, and given the policies and outlook, is a worrisome factor, quite a worrisome development. And the fact that the deterrence so far has not produced much of a result, and denuclearization, while it's an objective, there is no plausible approach that is in sight, at least. Hopefully something will work out sooner than later. With this, let me invite Dr. Swaran Singh. I hope he has had his morning cup of tea and has already exercised and gone for a walk, because it's just about 5 o'clock in the morning at where he is. But Dr. Swaran Singh, so nice to see you, sir, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. And I think that is advantage of having been in diplomacy for a long time. I remember, perhaps correctly, that you have spent time in Vancouver and, of course, in Seoul. I'm delighted to be with the esteemed panelists, General Jung, General Lama, Dr. Saha, my friend Lakhvinder. But most of all, I'm delighted to see Ma'am Madhuri Sondhi on my screen. It's such a delight, ma'am, to see you again. And I want to join Shivaji and Vivekanand in my salutations to my professor, M.L. Sondhi. Rightly said that the visions that he had, and some of those were seen as peripheral issues for Indian foreign policy, have over years become the mainstream foreign policy, whether it is Asia-Pacific engagement or nuclear policy. I remember Professor Sondhi not just as a great, brilliant scholar, national leader, but to us students, most accessible professor. I remember as young, very innocent, sometimes simpleton students, we could even stop his Maruti van on the road to say, please sign some papers. I remember having come home for signatures for my MPhil dissertation. So it's a great way to remember Professor M.L. Sondhi's contributions and his personality, that, ma'am, you have sustained this Institute for Asia-Pacific Affairs in his name. And delighted to see that Shivaji and Vivekanand have not only pursued their father's great excellence and continued in academic careers, but also are contributing to M.L. Sondhi Institute for Asian Affairs to remember his memory. I can see Shivaji on my screen and Vivekanand also. It's a great recall of great times that I think, and great inspiration and learning we had from Professor Sondhi. The issue that I wish to use my maybe 8 to 10 minutes now is to underline soft power as we talk about military and strategic, sort of components of relationship with the South Korea. And I was delighted to see that Ambassador Vishnu Prakash began by citing a speech of Prime Minister, saying that when he was chief minister, he saw South Korea as a model of a similar size to transform Gujarat into a similar miracle. I think the same example continues to be very, very effective and relevant if we look at using soft power as component that would strengthen and sort of streamline India's influence around the world, of course, backed by our strategic and military prowess in that sense. Of course, we have repeatedly heard of Buddhism being the greatest link between our two nations. Indeed, as we speak in this panel today, there are about 108 South Korean pilgrims who are on pilgrimage from 18th of February. And I think they'll continue till about 23rd of March on a 43-day walking tour of 1,100 kilometers on what we call the Buddhist circuit, and experiencing and sort of receiving teachings on Buddhism and Buddha from his birth to his parinirvana. And that itself is an example of the connect of 108 Korean pilgrims being on the walk as we speak now. In fact, this is something which is again very central to Prime Minister's vision of using culture, diaspora linkages in taking India's foreign policy objectives forward. So when it comes to India and South Korea, there are enormous advantage that we have. Talking about almost the first century BC being the beginning of the link. You would remember the 13th century book called Samguk Yusa that outlines that whole story of Princess of Ayodhya, Suriratna, marrying King Kim Suno. And then, of course, onwards, the other books by Hong Chiao that talk about vivid accounts of culture, politics, life in India. The book is called Pilgrimage of Five Kingdoms in India. And all the way to the independence and onwards, the recognition that India extended in 1962 and full diplomatic relations in 1973. India's cultural centers being set up, the busts of Tagore and Gandhi being installed there, India's cultural festivals of Sarang being organized. These are kind of usual things. But I think what I want to underline here is the kind of, we keep mentioning, the miracle that South Korea, which Ambassador Vishnu Prakash alluded to in the very beginning. And in that sense, how is that miracle relevant for India? Miracle of Korea in that sense begins from roughly around early 1990s when India's opening up and liberalization also begins. And then, of course, it becomes the kind of powerhouse in exporting steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, cell phones. We have all of these companies around the world that, whichever part of the world you travel, you find these Korean companies and their products being available. But that Korean wave, which is also sometimes called Hallyu, has resulted in what Korean Foundation in its study of 2019 says, having about 90 million fans of Korea. Hallyu fans have reached about almost 100 million now around the world. And that, I think, is what is important for India to keep in mind, that the economic miracle has been followed by the cultural miracle, and that soft power that South Korea has kind of heralded over a period of time is amazing. I mean, in fact, I have even a personal story of a friend's daughter having gone to Seoul now, and she's learning drums. That kind of enormous influence that Korea now is wielding, whether it is in terms of its pop culture groups, BTS or Blackpink or SHINee, Twice, Expo, Text, and Hyphen, or K-dramas, for example, on television, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, or Crash Landing on You, and so on. So in that sense, whether it is music or dance or drama, food, movies, fashion, cosmetics, they all have now become very powerful tool and engine of growth. In fact, continuing that economic miracle, accelerating that speed fast forward is something that has happened very, very interestingly in Korea in the last about decade or so. How that miracle of both economic miracle, which India also is pursuing now, but the cultural miracle of the enormous soft power that Korea now reflects can be also a lesson for India now, Narendra Modi being the Prime Minister, to replicate the same lesson again in India. And that is where India's soft power to follow, not just having Tata and TCS presenting itself in Korea, but also the enormous traditional wisdom that India has had. I think how to make use of enormous soft power that India also have in terms of not just setting up few cultural centers. Where in Korea, in Busan, in Seoul, we are teaching yoga, we are teaching dance forms, cooking, and all other things, and languages, etc. But how to make use of that model or example of Korea emerging as a great soft power powerhouse in that sense. Among others, for example, they also have Seolgi Titok culture of now they talk about sharing their wealth or goodies or whatever they have achieved with what they call marginalized neighbors and people. So in that sense, I think it is important to underline a very important report that has come out from India's Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs this year. It's titled India's Soft Power and Cultural Diplomacy, Prospects and Limitations. Now that I won't take too long to talk about it. Basically, three important limits that it has underlined where India needs to focus on and invest in replicating, as I said, if we have to replicate Korean example again, in enhancing India's soft power, and that will again bring India Korea much closer. The three limitations that it talks about this year is limitations of budget. We understand, and Ambassador Vishnu Prakash will vouch me, the budget of Ministry of External Affairs is roughly around 0.4% of India's GDP, compared to the budget of India's Ministry of Defense being now about 2% of India's GDP. So if we have to match up the soft power with hard power of India, I think that need to be corrected. So budget is the first limitation that this report of Parliament Committee on External Affairs brings out. And then, of course, it also talks about the second limitation of talented personnel. And I think that is where the issue of lateral entries and co-option and taking on consultants from outside in sort of strengthening Ministry of External Affairs in pushing forward that soft power approach is important. And third, I think is completely understandable, is maximizing interministerial coordination. And that is where it talks about various agencies that Ministry of External Affairs has, whether it is restructuring of Indian Council of Cultural Relations, which I think has about 100 chairs in various universities around the world, and using those as to how to globally market India's indigenous wisdom, India's culture, food, fashion, and so on. So in that sense, what I'm underlining is how Korea can again become a lesson for India to make sure India's soft power becomes another miracle, like Korean miracle. And therefore, that will bring much more advantage point to both India's economic prowess, as India wants to move forward and achieve 5 trillion economy by 2025, but also make India's military power more effective. Because military power, as you know, we are also moving in military diplomacy, in joint exercises, HADR. So it's not necessarily the missiles and fighters and bombs and ammunitions. Sometimes power projections are much more effective, and therefore that is where the soft power model of South Korea becomes much more relevant for India. And I think that is where I hope that Indian Prime Minister, just as he remembered Korean example when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he would keep in mind the miracle that South Korea has brought about in pushing forward that K culture, K-pop, K-music, K-food, and K-everything, inspiring youth around the world. And I think, therefore, there are lessons for India to learn from South Korea in pushing forward the soft power and using soft power to sort of make its economic incentivization or military prowess much more effective in achieving greater influence around the world. Let me stop here, and I look forward to any comments and questions that might come my way, and I'll be happy to respond to them. Thank you, and back to Ambassador Vishnu Prakash.
Thank you, Dr. Soren Singh. A very interesting linkage that you have drawn between soft power and economic miracle, and soft power being a foundation on which you can build so many things, and which is a very interesting thought, and I would tend to agree with that. You're right about Buddhism, which is a very strong bond between India and South Korea. And the best part is the popular goodwill that exists between the two countries, between the two people, that cannot be engendered very easily. And once that is there, that becomes an enabling factor in building relationships and taking relationships forward. With this, I would like to invite Dr. Lakhwinder Singh for his remarks. It's so nice to see, even though virtually, Dr. Lakhwinder Singh after a long time. The floor is yours, Mr. Singh.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to start by paying my regards to Mrs. Sondhi. Thank you, ma'am. For me, it's like homecoming. So happy to see you here. Now, I would like to start with a personal note. When 25 years ago, Professor Emil Sondhi sent me to Korea, there was not many people who could understand the importance of Korea. But he could clearly see the strategic importance of Korea. And he convinced me that I should go to Korea, not USA or other country. And he said Korea will be a very important part of India's growth story in the coming years. Today, he has been proved right. Today, India and Korea are working together like never before. So we can say today's webinar is our homage to his visionary leadership, the kind of role he has played in building the foundations of India-Korea cooperation cannot be ignored by anyone. Today, the kind of work his students are doing both in Korea as well as in India is unprecedented and having a huge impact in giving a new direction to this very important relationship in the Asia-Pacific regions. So we must understand the kind of role Professor Sondhi has played in building the foundations of this relationship. It's our duty to emphasize again and again from where this whole thing is coming. As we all know, India and South Korea has long historical ties. Even during the Korean War, India played a very important role in bringing peace to the region. It was India's role who could bring both North Korea and South Korea negotiation table and could solve their very intricate problems. But unfortunately, after the war ended, due to Cold War, we was pushed back. We was not able to keep our engagement with both Koreas. And somehow, willingly or unwillingly, we was seen as a partner of North Korea because of our association with the US, Soviet Union. And that left a very bad impact on South Korean psychology. So when Cold War ended, our relationship immediately started picking up, 1990. So it was just a matter of few years when people like Professor Sondhi took the lead and start coming to Korea, and even he sent me with a very clear mission that we have to put the relationship into place. So by the time Modi ji came to the scene, which is already a flourishing relationship between two countries. So when he gave the Modi Moon vision for peace and prosperity, along with the joint statement, that upgraded their relationship to special strategic partnership. That was the basic foundation which our leaders put into place to give the current push to the relationship. As you know, this year we have a new, last year we have a new South Korean leadership. And that leadership is looking towards India in a very special way. In his Indo-Pacific strategy, it's a very broad vision. For the first time, Korea is looking towards the region in a very big way. As you know, Korea is known as a hermit kingdom. Hermit kingdom was Korea was satisfied looking within. It was very rarely looked at the outside world. But now, for the first time, Korea is looking towards the region in a very big way. And India occupies a very special place in this new strategy. So possibility of cooperation is limitless. There's also already a convergence between new Southern policy as well as India's Acts policy, and free and open Indo-Pacific region. So these two policies of South Korea and India are bringing two countries together like never before. And this is giving push to stronger economic cooperation. We already have India-Korea comprehensive economic partnership talks going on. Last year, we have a 9th round of discussion to upgrade the free trade agreement to working level, functional level. Initially, it played a very important role, but somehow, because of basic contradiction between the economic situation between North and South Korea and India, it couldn't work properly. But now, with the new leadership in the place, new push is coming. And this year, we saw that we have a very successful foreign policy security dialogue in Seoul. Then our foreign secretary came to, Joint Secretary came to Korea, and we had a very thoughtful discussion between two countries. So now our area of focus is getting bigger and bigger than before. Never before like this kind of issues we are not discussing. Now we are talking about comprehensive strategic partnership and talking about building a new rule-based order in the region. This is a very new agenda. Korea and India was never talking like this. This new agenda which has come into the play is bringing new synergy between India and Korea together. New element which is coming to play is China. Both India and China are finding it very difficult how to accommodate China. Both don't want to take a hard position against China because there are very complicated economic as well as defense ties with China. So I think China element is also giving a new push to India-Korea strategic partnership. So I think because India has long experience to handle China, so I think Korea can learn something important from India, how to do the strategic balancing between USA as well as China. For South Korea is a new thing to do the strategic balance. It was already heavily tilted towards USA, but now because of a new emerging balance of power in the region, South Korea is finding it more and more difficult to accommodate China's interest in the region. I think India could be a very important role in helping South Korea to teach to how to accommodate China's interest. So India's strategic balancing policy could be a very important role for South Korea. This is important lesson which South Korea can learn from. Other thing which is very important for now for the region is that our agenda has much changed. Earlier we were just focused on just trade and investment, but now we are talking about rule-based order, G20, Indo-Economic Forum. So this kind of new issues which has come into play have broadened the scope, broadened the area for discussion between Korea and South Korea. I think for that we need a new, as General Amba said, we need a new body, new platform to engage South Korea. So far, somehow we have not able to accommodate our strategic interest, growing strategic interest in the region. But time has come, we should create new platforms, new bodies which can have broadened the discussion and broadly engage with South Koreans. 10 years ago, we had a what we call India Chamber of Commerce. But somehow its agenda, its mandate is very narrow. It just focus on trade and investment. But I think time has come when we should broaden our platform, broaden our body, so that we can engage with South Koreans in a much bigger platform. So that new issues, new areas which are emerging between South Korea and India can be comprehensively addressed. I strongly believe that time has come when we should engage North Korea on a much bigger scale than we are doing so far. For that, we need a comprehensive intellectual support from our Indian strategic thinkers. So we have to create a new body which can give push. As you know, Koreans have created a very big platform in India. So they are operating in a very big way. But so far, our engagement with South Korea is much lower scale. But I think to balance our engagement, we have to create something like this. Another important point which we have to do that, we have to help South Korea to play a bigger role in Quad. As you know, Korea has been trying to enter Quad dialogues. So far, it was not successful. But I think India can help Korea to play a bigger role in Quad. And that is also very important platform in which South Korea and India can work together in creating a rule-based regional order in the region.
Dr. Singh,
so far, you know, as far as the strategic defense cooperation is concerned.
1 minute, please.
Yes, sir. As far as the defense cooperation is concerned, so far, you know, our focus has been mainly what we call defense industry cooperation. But somehow we have ignored our defense alignment. That has been ignored, or that has been paid less attention than in defense industry cooperation. But I think most important is that we have a balanced approach. Both defense alignment and defense industry cooperation go side by side. So we should create more training, more education, more doctrine level alignment between two countries. That is very important. So far, we have not paid much attention to that. Another important area is that for South Korea, peace on Korean Peninsula is very important. During the Korean War, we played a very important role. But so now, currently, our peace building efforts on Korean Peninsula is almost nothing. I think time has come again when we should play a more active role in peace building on Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, for highlighting some of the very important aspects of India-Korea relationship and focusing on the broadening cooperation in newer areas, which is very important, especially the defense and security cooperation, and also bringing in the China factor, which certainly plays a role in shaping the outlook of both India and South Korea to an extent. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, friends, for very comprehensive, very substantive presentations. We have now about 30 minutes in which we can go over, the question. If we have, then we will address some questions that may be there. But may I raise 3 issues on which I would solicit your inputs and request you your thoughts on these or any other aspect over for 2 or 3 minutes each. One is the big challenge that Dr. Lakhvinder Singh mentioned and other panelists also mentioned about the balancing of relations, the challenge that Korea faces of balancing relations between China and the US. On one side is the security and strategic partnership, a political partnership, alliance, and then there is the economic dependence and the ability of China to not only weaponize economic issues, but cause a lot of economic discomfort and even go beyond that. So how does Korea do that, and whether Korea is successful in doing that? The other side of the coin is Korea-Japan relations, and which are, if I were to put it mildly, are uncomfortable. And that relationship, which is important for both Korea and Japan to get it right, to strengthen their alliance, strengthen the overall strategic posture and deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea. And last but not the least is the question of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, where hope is receding. But do you see any possibilities, and if so, what would they be? So, but these are just my thoughts. If you would like to reflect on any particular aspect, I would we'll all be very appreciative. Let me start with Dr. Premisha Saha and then move over to General Lamba. Premisha.
Yes, would like to deal with 2 parts, that's China, US, and Korea, Japan, because very sincerely speaking, North Korea is not my area of specialization, so I won't dive into it. But with regards to China, US, I think I agree with Dr. Singh when he said that Korea can draw some lessons from India when it comes to the balancing between US and China. But I think there is also another region from which Korea can draw a lesson, and I think that is Southeast Asia as well. Many say that, because of China's growing economic influence in Southeast Asia, there has been a divide caused within the ASEAN because how differently countries look at the South China Sea dispute, for example. This is just to give an example. But at the same time, one also needs to realize that how this region is also drawing benefits from both these countries with their balancing and hedging. You see countries like Philippines, for example, drawing defense, with the recent EDCA getting upgraded and US being given 4 new locations for accessing advanced access to bases, basically. So how they are drawing benefits from both the countries in the areas that both these countries excel in. For example, when it comes to defense and security, they are looking at the US, but when it comes to economics, they're looking at China. Because complete decoupling from China when it comes to economic sector is logically speaking not possible at the moment. Though we are talking about alternative supply chain networks, but I think most countries realize, and even if we see India, for example, no matter what, it has been highlighted in repeated platforms that the China-India relations have soured, and there has been a breach of trust. But when you look at the trade figures, not much has changed. I mean, the trade between the two countries is only growing. So when it comes to complete economic decoupling, I think that would take time. So I think there is that need of balancing. And if you look at the recent document as well, there has been mention of US much more than China when it comes to recent Korea Indo-Pacific vision, because I think even when the president was talking about it, and they very clearly mentioned that we would be following the steps of the US, but nowhere was it mentioned that Korea would be completely moving away from its economic partnership with China. So I think that balance would be maintained wherever it is required, and I think that's a that's a cautious approach, but I think that's the approach needed currently. The second question with regard to Japan. Yes, it's true that Korea-Japan relations have had its share of ups and downs, and in the recent strategy, when they have tailored areas of cooperation with countries, even with what they can cooperate with countries like Canada, for example, on climate change, even what they can do with countries like Australia, with Africa. When it comes to Japan, they've clearly mentioned that when it comes to the North Korea issue, we have to talk to Japan as well. We have to keep the Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, US alliance intact as well. So there will be attempts to, work with Japan when, wherever it is needed. So I think that realization is there, and also from the Japanese, and I think that realization is there that there is a need now to move beyond the differences if they have to deal with the other challenge that they face with regards to Japan when it comes to East China Sea and with regard to Korea in the North Korea issue. So in those regards, I think Japan and Korea have to move beyond the differences. And I think they're doing that. Both countries are a part of the IPEF as well, though it is in a very nascent stage. But again, it's one step where they are looking to work together in an economic framework of the Indo-Pacific. So there are ways, and I think in that US will also play a role when it comes to the Korea-Japan relations getting smoother, let me put it that way. I think US will also have a role to play in that, because will be in US's interest also that these two countries maintain good relations at the same time in East Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. General Lamba. You need to unmute yourself, General Lamba.
A number of issues you've highlighted, you flagged, sir, and I'll try and put that maze of things together in the best way I can. And the first one you said, sir, is about Korea and Japan coming together and what prospects there are really to stand up to China together. Very important question. Second is about the South China Seas and how things happen is what Premasha mentioned. And third is about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. With the challenge of China that's really taken acute dimensions today, I think Japan and South Korea have really little leeway left but to come together. If Russia and China today can together look at US and the world, it's the circumstances that put them together. The kind of conflicts till 5 years back convinced us that this kind of a coordination or alignment may not be easily possible, but it's come faster than ever expected. And I think the dynamics of Ukraine and the US rise back into by its pivots into South China Seas and East Asia making a difference. So South Korea and Japan, sir, they have to look at they have to review, they have to get past the past, and they have to look at it. It's a question of the leaders truly stepping out of what was really a period of Holocaust, and I've seen what is there in the DMZ and memories that really shake you up. I've read so much about what happened that I think only the leaders and the people can put it together in perspective of the past and not to threaten, because the day it happens, I see a phenomenal exponential cooperation between the two nations that would actually put a big challenge to China. Second one, Premasha just brought out, there are those regions of ASEAN which look differently, and because of the economic tie-ups with China and the economic and the military tie-ups with the United States. But I think that's a challenge that people like that India has been through. Nobody more than us in the military have actually experienced the direct impact of economics versus military. In many of the events that we had, and we had very senior people from Indian bureaucracy and the Indian diplomat and very senior diplomats, we would always struggle for which will be the ultimate truth in my view, and that is economics and security have to go hand in hand. We cannot allow $80 billion trade with China and say that's 10 billion is what we give and 70 is what comes in. And there are 70 years of a disparity in inability, total, not inability, I think it's their denial to fix the line that we would want. So one day security has to counterbalance economics. Oh, we withdraw, we keep back and we make sure that no matter what, and Atmanirbharta is a glorious example of saying how we can do it, offset not only our imports, but hugely go on to exports. So I would say that there are, and for Indo-Pacific, if I relate it very specifically, Indo-Pacific is a challenge because the supply chains that have shifted with industry moving out of China, we need to secure the supply chain areas in the Indo-Pacific. Till that is done, one cannot hope to allow the industry, the military industry, the civil industry, and so on, to operate in a free passage with all the threats that China poses today.
1 minute.
Yes.
One
minute, sir. Denuclearization of North Korea. The way it has gone, it is actually said a lot. The last doctrine, it has banned discussion, it has banned reversal of this thought process, and its doctrine is virtually proactive, sir. So I think having reached that far, denuclearization to me personally looks virtually not in the foreseeable future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Swaran Singh.
Thank you, sir. I think the China factor, I was intentionally not bringing it up in my initial remarks, but you raised this issue, and this is very interesting. Because in some sense, the way China factor was understood in South Korea has changed over a period of time. But interesting it is that it has also changed in case of other major stakeholders in the region, Japan and India. So, you know, until Moon Jae-in period, there was much focus on balanced foreign policy. And there is an apparent tilt since then. I think Yoon administration is far more inclined to align closely with the United States in taking a kind of a stern and affirmative kind of stance, which comes much closer to United States stance on China, and mending ways with the new Kishida administration in Japan compared to Shinzo Abe's period. And likewise, India, you know, clearly given the tensions on the border, India has kind of also moved closer to United States. So Japan, South Korea, India together, I think in that sense are moving closer to the line that Biden administration usually takes on China. It is not the same as Mike Pompeo's line, but it is still very assertive American line on describing China as a systemic challenge. The second element which makes it more interesting is both South Korea and India, while, you know, having that kind of inclination, or shall we say tilt, in their approach to China factor, and by extension maybe even to North Korea, both continue to be deeply intertwined, entrenched, shall we say even dependent. on their economic engagement with China. For example, in case of India, border tensions have continued, but the bilateral trade has also continued to grow. I think one of the most rapidly growing bilateral trade, and the worst is that it is one-sided trade. For last year, I think we have jumped now to
125.
30 seconds. The Chinese exports have reached now last year $118 billion. India imports $180 billion, which is I think 17% of total imports of India from around the world. So both South Korea and China and India, as they wish to sort of try to recalibrate their China policy, continue to be deeply dependent, whether it is APIs for making India pharmacy of the world, etc. But let me stop here. So there are convergences which I want to underline when it comes to either North Korea or China.
Thank you. The fact remains, you alluded to that, the fact remains that the Korean polity is equally divided between the liberals and the conservatives. And so every 5 years there is a change, and depending on who is in the blue house, the conservatives or the liberals, there is obviously a tweaking of the policy orientation. So that has been the case for the last 3-4 decades that we have been seeing. Dr. Lakhvinder Singh.
Thank you, sir. I think the most important factor in India-Korea relationship is China. And this is very delicate. It can break the relationship as well as to break the relationship. You know, if we push too hard against China, South Korea may walk away. If South Korea push too hard against China, we may walk away. So there's a limit to which we can push or become friends with China. So this is a very delicate relationship. Very delicately, and we need to properly understand to what extent we can come together and facing China together, and to what extent we can take a position together against China, and at the same time, to what extent we cannot touch China. So I think this is very important relationship, which should be properly understood, properly studied before we take a decision on working together on China. This is very delicate, both for Korea as well as for South India. So this is must be taken very seriously, because too much stake is at stake now, and we have to adopt. When we make a call for strategic partnership, the South Korea Defense Cooperation in China, Chinese are immediately taking, they are lining, they are joining hands against us. So it has very negative overtones for China. So we have to make sure that when we are developing our defense cooperation, defense industry cooperation, the Chinese are not deeply become suspicious. Because they are always looking, at us that something is cooking between South Korea and India. To what extent we can play this has a very important role. So that's the critical point I want to today emphasize, that some of our agreements, some of our declarations are very lofty, but their substance is very low. But so they, to some extent, unnecessarily scare China. So my suggestion today is that our declaration should be less lofty, less noisy, and more substantial. So that is because we have to handle China very carefully. So that's what I'm talking about, putting together a new concept of strategic balancing. To what extent we can handle China without provoking China. So this is a very important point which we should keep in mind when we join hands together in South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean, in the South Asian countries. So our need of the hour is that without provoking, we come together. So that fine balance has to be kept between our strategic defense policy.
Point very well made.
Number two, second point I want to say is that India is a country of peace. So now this is our moral obligation to some extent. I feel that during the Korean War, we played a very important role in bringing two Korea together to stop hostility. Now, India, South Korea, and North Korea are coming towards nuclear clash. So, but what extent we are playing a role in peace building on Korean Peninsula is very less. I think Korean to some extent expect us to because we have very good relationship with North Korea also. To some extent, we can lower the temperature between South Korea and North Korea. So, to some extent, so far our peace building effort in Korean Peninsula is very, very low. But to some extent, I feel time has come when India should become more and more active on Korean Peninsula and building peace.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very important points made. I would now invite the participants if there are any questions. The floor is open to questions. Yes, Mr. Sarabjit Parmar, your question, please. Kindly introduce yourself, and if your question, you can briefly pose your question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm unmuted. Ambassador, I'm Captain Parmar. I'm a senior fellow of the National Maritime Foundation, and good evening to old friends. And Swaran, it's time for a sundowner here, but you'll have to do with coffee wherever you are. And my thanks to Professor Lakhvinder Singh for extending an invite, and to the ML the Association. And General Ambassador, good evening. It's been a long time. Pramesh, nice to see you. I'll cut to the chase. I have a couple of observations, and I think I'd like to welcome comments from the panelists and anybody else here. First is the issue of South Korea calling itself a pivotal state. And I've analyzed the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy. It's available on our website. If we go by the Hague Center for Security Studies definition of a pivotal state, that it's one that possesses military, economic, or ideational strategic assets, and it positions South Korea as a pivot state with economic strategic goods. And I go back to what Pramesha said, that a relationship with China based on economics. So if being a global pivotal state is going to be one of the main points or pillars of South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, then it may find it difficult to break loose from the economic tight hold China has on many nations, even though the strategy lays out a roadmap of economic engagement with many nations across the number of regions it has put in its strategy, starting from North Pacific. That's one point. Second is Russia. Now, there is no mention of Russia. Now, why I mentioned Russia is last year, Russia came out with its maritime doctrine, and it spoke about engaging Asia. There is no mention of China in the doctrine, but the approach to the Pacific and Asia is very clearly a repetition of the Cold War era, where Russia was looking for warm water ports. And given the close bonhomie growing between Russia and China, and of course South Korea airspace has been violated by both Russian and aircraft operating together over a period of time, which China calls as the annual plan. And of course, Russia stated that it was done because of the North Korea's missile firing, and to observe that. But the point here is that what stops China from opening its port of Dalian, which is in the North Theater Command and which faces the Korean Peninsula, because Dalian, if I remember, is an ice-free port throughout the year. And that is a certain absence in all the Indo-Pacific strategies that have come out so far, the absence of Russia. Do remember Vladimir Putin has spoken about the pivot to Asia in 2012. It's not worked out. Ukraine has happened. Before that, Crimea was there. But I think then there needs to be a lookout on Russia. Last point, sir, and one is on Japan. Now, South Korea-Japan relations have been quite rocky since after the Cold War. And I do understand there is a section in South Korea that is a little wary of Japan. And if we look at the 5-nation trip that the Japanese Prime Minister carried out in January, seeking rearming of Japan, lifting of exports, I think there may be a little bit more that needs to be done to soften South Korea-Japan relations, especially in the light of the relations that exist and the overall alliance background that the US would have to balance between South Korea and Japan. I'll stop here. I'll welcome comments from the panelists and participants. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Any other question, comment? If there is no other question or comment, I would invite any panelists who would like to respond to or reflect, share his thoughts on the points or her thoughts on the points that Mr. Parmar has made. All right. Well, with this, let us then bring this symposium to a close. Before I hand over to Mr. Shivaji Sondhi, I would like to sincerely thank all panelists for the wonderful perspectives that they provided. And it's a pleasure to have interacted with all of you. Thank you very much. Over to Shivaji.
Thank you, Ambassador Prakash. So let me start by thanking you for joining today and presiding over the entire discussion with the tact one expects from seasoned diplomats, as well as attention to the clock. And then I'd like to thank the speakers. I guess Major General Jung has perhaps left, but obviously him, Dr. Saha, General Lamba, Dr. Swan Singh, and Dr. Lakhwinder Singh. I would note that my father was a graduate of Khalsa College, Jalandhar, and so he would have been particularly pleased at the composition of the panel. Then I would like to thank my brother, Vivekanand, who's actually the person who now runs the programming for the Eminent Sondhi Institute, and he's the one who does all the hard work. And as I say every time, my job is simply to show up and thank various people, which is easily done. So it was a terrific discussion. It really is very striking to me that, you know, as a couple of the panelists already said, that what was once upon a time a sort of niche obsession in the Sondhi household has ended up being something that is now centrally and openly discussed, as was done here. So it's great to see, and thank you all for coming and being part of this really excellent and topical and timely discussion.